Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the In Dialogue event here today at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. We have 1.5 hours ahead of us in which we'll be discussing Alexander Kustov's new book. I have it right here, In Our Interest, How Democracies Can Make Immigration Popular. It was published by Columbia University Press just a few weeks ago. And to discuss the book, we've put together a fantastic panel, which I will very briefly introduce. So first up, we have, of course, the author himself. Alex Kustov is a political scientist and a professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He received his PhD from Princeton. And Alex researches governance and public opinion, especially through computational and experimental methods, and with a focus on immigration to high-income democracies. Next, we have Marc Helbling, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Mannheim, where he also holds the chair in migration and integration. And he has published extensively on migration and citizenship policies, on public attitudes around issues relating to both immigration and diversity, as well as the causes of migration and the integration of immigrants. And just like Alex, he is also an expert on quantitative methods of social research. And then finally, we have Karen Schönwälder, who is a political scientist and a research group leader here at the Institute, as well as a professor at the University of Göttingen. And Karen has researched and published extensively on societal responses to diversity, on the role of immigrants in politics, and also on policies shaping heterogeneous societies, especially in Germany and the UK. And she has also led, among others, the DIVA project here at the Institute, Diversity Ascent in Urban Germany, which I'm sure we'll talk about today as well. And my name is Ulrike Bialas. I am a postdoctoral research fellow and a sociologist here at the Institute, and I will be moderating today's event. And as for the general structure of the event, so we have 1.5 hours. We will first discuss the book just amongst the panelists for about an hour, its larger implications, also its relation to Germany. Then we'll open up the floor to questions and comments from the audience, both on site and online. And before I give Alex the chance to introduce his book, I just want to encourage all the panelists to, once he's introduced the book, please feel free to jump in at any moment and comment, because I think we have a lot to talk about, and we're a small circle, so I think we can just have a conversation. But before we do, I would like to give Alex a chance to tell us a bit about the book. And very generally, I would like you to perhaps first explain to us, so when I read the title of the book, it seems to me to go quite against the sort of grain or current trend of focusing on people opposing migration. So I just wonder, what is your motivation for writing the book? Where did your interest in this topic come from? How did you come to this topic, and how did you come to write this book?
Yeah, thank you, Ulrike, for this generous introduction and the question. I, had a lot of motivations to write this book, but I think the biggest one was definitely this feeling of frustration that I've had with our immigration debate, and not just in Germany or the US, but kind of immigrant receiving democracies more generally, both on the academic side and the public discourse side as well, right? So we know that in politics, right, the immigration debate right now is, I think, heavily dominated by the two extremes, right? On the one side, you want to kind of stop all possible migration, no matter whether it's good or bad. We just don't want it here. For whatever reason, right? On the other side, you really want to be compassionate and open to everyone, right? And it's really hard to have any kind of middle ground here, right? And I think in the academic debate, as you rightly mentioned, I think there is a lot of focus, including my own research and the research of a lot of folks here, on why people oppose immigration. Is it due to prejudice, authoritarianism, or some kind of other factor that exists? And we identify, I feel like, so many things at this point already, right? But I think there is definitely a lack of focus on under what condition, if any, people would actually be willing to support some immigration, if not all, right? And so that's kind of where I wanted to come in and try to provide a more optimistic account, even though it does imply that we need to have some compromise, right? If I had to summarize my book with just one simple sentence, it would be that migration can be popular, right? But the only way to do that and make immigration popular is actually to make better policies, right? For governments in power with some resolve to actually enact those policies that people are going to be able to see for themselves that they're good for them, not just with being told that immigration is actually good yet again.
Mm-hmm. And we'll come to that in a moment because, of course, that's the kind of crux of your book. But just to maybe take a step back and to kind of establish the status quo. So I think it's very easy anecdotally to just assume that migration must be extremely unpopular when we watch the media, political campaigns, maybe conversation that we overhear. Could you just give us a sense, like, what do we know empirically? How unpopular is migration actually?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, the devil in the details, as usual, right? I think on one hand, you can clearly look at all kind of available survey data that we have in most countries and see that most people want to decrease immigration right now, right? And I think to that end, I think immigration is clearly unpopular in most democracies, right? We can see that, just looking at the political platforms and campaigns, no one is really campaigning on increasing immigration, right? We have all the anti-immigration parties everywhere, but there is not a single pro-immigration party that I'm aware of, right? There are obviously green parties that are more pro-immigration than others, but it's not their main thing. To some extent, I think it's true that immigration is unpopular in most cases, right? But I don't think it's inherently, categorically so. And a lot of people, as I show, are actually willing to support some immigration under certain conditions, but not others. And in fact, if you try to delve into the detail of actually what people believe about immigration and various policies, they are actually much more open than we usually assume them to be. If we, are allowed to get a little bit into the weeds really quick, I think there is a very important distinction between kind of more relative views or preferences that people might have in terms of just like, wanting more or less immigration, right? And I think now we see that a lot of people in many contexts want to have less immigration. I think this does not necessarily have to do with anything related to the actual numbers, but just with the sense of frustration that a lot of people have about how immigration is handled by their governments. But I think in terms of people, what people actually want from immigration in this kind of absolute sense, we actually see a lot more room for openness, right? And I think what I document is that a lot of people, what they want is that they want to have immigration that is well managed, that is controlled, that can potentially be culturally integrated, and most importantly, economically beneficial, right? If those kind of not very strict conditions are kind of all taken care of, actually a lot of people would be totally fine with significantly opening up of our immigration policies around the world.
Okay, and maybe just very briefly, since we're talking about people's attitudes, generally speaking, is this something, like how fickle are attitudes to biographical events, world events? What do we know? Like, do people generally establish an attitude in their teenage years and then stick with that throughout their lives, or are they willing to change? Or
so one of my initial kind of research project that kind of led to the creation of the work was exactly about the stability of attitudes, which is somewhat surprising, right? But it's the stability of people's kind of absolute views of what they want from immigration, right? And so what we do see in the data when we kind of look at the so-called longitudinal surveys where we interview the same people over and over again, is that people might kind of oscillate and change their mind a little bit in response to certain external shocks like the refugee crisis or some kind of different political campaign, but in the end of the day they kind of go back to their initial equilibrium. But I think what does change quite a bit is those relative preferences, right? And we see that a lot in the public opinion data. So for instance, I think as many of you know here, like in the US and some other countries recently, we had a complete reversal of those relative views, right? So I can, just tell you firsthand, when I started presenting some of this research a couple of years ago, some people were just wondering why bother? Because if you looked at those kind of public opinion data in the US, you saw, kind of slight and gradual, but sort of kind of positivity trend, more or less, right? But then, a couple of years ago, it got completely reversed, right? So now we know that for sure that, this kind of general sense of immigration support can never be taken for granted, right? It's what I certainly see in a lot of those surveys is that, it's much easier to lose people trust on immigration than to gain it, right? And kind of the main question that I'm preoccupied with in this book and kind of broader set of project is exactly to figure out how we can achieve public support for immigration in a more durable sense, right? Not just like at this particular point of time as a response to some another cruelty of the Trump administration or whatnot, right? But actually have it in a much more durable way. Because unfortunately, what we have now in the sense of those relative attitudes is that, we have, some kind of big event related to immigration mismanagement, some kind of border crisis or whatnot, or where a lot of people kind of lash back on their government in terms of so-called anti-immigration backlash. And then we have right-wing populists come to power or kind of break into the parliament in some countries, right? And then when they do come to power and they do something completely meaningless, senseless, and cruel, then we have the pro-immigration backlash, right? And then we go back and forth between those two extremes with no end in sight, but, people suffer, right? Actual living people are not getting their livelihood, like their freedoms are constrained. A lot of people are actually dying because of our closed borders, right? So in the end of the day, it's not good for anyone, right? So in this sense, actually, another message of my book, which I really cannot emphasize enough, is that making immigration popular is not just a good idea for the liberal cause of some kind, right? Even if you are a moderate person or a conservative person or a politician, it's in your interest to actually have immigration policies that are actually popular and command trust among the majority of folks, right? You want your own immigration policies to be popular, and right now in many countries, just think about the Trump administration right now, their immigration policies are certainly not popular even with their own voters.
And we will certainly talk about those implications because they're extremely important, but maybe just before we do, and also before we open up the discussion, just very basically, you mentioned the Trump administration a couple of times. You're a researcher working in the US. Are your arguments mainly about the US, or which countries are we talking about here?
Yeah, so I mean, I have to admit, I have to talk a lot about the US because I'm from the US, and that's kind of what people are interested oftentimes, including in places outside of the US, but book is unabashedly comparative, right? So I mainly focus actually on comparing Canada and Sweden as, from my perspective, they're in the two extremes of either very kind of pragmatic and more kind of humanitarian approaches. And also, talk a lot and use the data from the UK, Germany, and most other OECD countries. As you mentioned, kind of in general, my research draws a lot on kind of high-income democracies and immigrant-receiving countries.
Okay. And maybe as a last question, because this will help us to, to really know what to make of this book, can you just tell us briefly your methodological approach to studying this and how you, in particular, conceptualized popularity?
Yeah, no, this is a great question because, another thing that, I'm not just making a philosophical argument here, right? I mean, I do talk a little bit about the normative implications and the policy implications of my evidence in the concluding chapter, right? But the book is also unabashedly empirical, right? And I'm primarily an empirical political scientist, and that's what I'm interested in, right? You might disagree with my normative stance or kind of my policy implications, but what I want you to do is to maybe learn and build on some of my empirical evidence, right? And we all know that immigration is a notoriously difficult problem to study. Just because, it's not determined randomly, right? No one is doing a randomized control trial of immigration policies. A lot of them are determined at the national, not just local levels, right? So what I'm trying to do is to use all possible available survey data from various cross-national projects, a lot of kind of my own original surveys and survey experiments. I'm also doing some of those so-called natural experiments where, something was kind of randomly decided out there in the world. And so you kind of try to leverage this randomness to figure out what drives people's opinions. And even though I'm not primarily a qualitative scholar, I also have a few chapters that just, talk in the detail of how various policies evolved, let's say in Canada and Sweden, and how, basically the transformations of the policy design led to various changes in public opinion too, right? So I'm really trying to attack this problem from all possible angles. Not to say to like satisfy everyone, but just to be able to say that it's not just my conclusions are not just based on just like one method or one country or one context, but have kind of a much broader picture of what's going on out there.
Yeah. Maybe not everyone knows what a natural experiment is. Could you very briefly give us an example? Because I, personally, not being a quantitative scholar, I'm very fascinated with natural experiments.
So it's one of those methods which kind of, at least according to some folks, bridges qualitative and quantitative scores, because you really have to have a deep knowledge of what's going on out there in the world to kind of figure out what to analyze. And I can tell you, so in this particular book, what I'm looking as, I'm interested in how people reacted to various high-profile immigration policies, let's say in the US, so things like DACA, which legalized some of the so-called dreamers who were brought to the US as kids, or some kind of other high-profile executive actions, right? And normally, it's hard to say what the actual effects of those policies are, just because the world is complex and there are so many different things are going on at the same time. And so what I'm doing there with some of my co-authors is that we are looking at like hundreds and thousands of survey responses that just happened just before and after the announcement of those policies. So we can be absolutely sure that these are basically the exact same kind of average people out there, let's say in the US, right? And so if we see any differences in their attitudes, it's probably due to this announcement of policy of some kind, right?
Yeah.
And by comparing like people who were surveyed just before and after, let's say the DACA announcement or the Muslim ban announcement, we can actually conclude that if anything, there was very little backlash to Obama's pro-immigration policies, but there was actually a lot of pro-immigration backlash to Trump's anti-immigration policies.
Yeah. So to identify causality, which is very difficult in the social sciences, right? Because we're talking about methods already, perhaps we could bring in the other panelists. Marc, I know you've done research on public attitudes as well, related to migration and diversity. And as I mentioned, you're also a scholar working quantitatively. How do you evaluate the methods used in this book and the kind of evidence and argumentation that Alex brings to us?
Well, I would say clearly this is a strength of the book that uses so many different data sources, and both at the individual and country level. So this analysis with survey data, survey experiments, but also he exploits data at the country level, so compares different policy indices with aggregated survey data, so can study it. Because, so as you already mentioned, the problem with when you study policy effects is that most of the time it's really difficult to study clear causal effects because you cannot randomize policies. I mean, there's some exceptional circumstances where you can do that, but you cannot say, well, you're going to introduce this policy in this country and another policy in another country, see what the different effects are. For all kinds of pragmatic and normative and ethical issues, you cannot do that. So you can do that maybe in a lab setting or in a survey setting. So you can study this at different levels, and maybe the one is more natural at the country level, but you cannot really randomize anything. At the individual level, you can randomize things and study these things, but it's less natural because it's more artificial. But then when you combine these things, you can actually combine the different strengths and weaknesses of these methods, and that's exactly what is going on in this book, among others. Of course, you then end up, I mean, there's some limitations that you obviously acknowledge that, when you compare countries, you basically can only do correlational analysis, and that's as good as it gets. But if you combine it with other approaches, you can, approach it from different perspectives, and that's clearly a strength of the book.
Yeah. It's also important, I think, that you mentioned this combination of various data sources, because I have to say, like as a scholar working mostly qualitatively, these kinds of lab experiments often seem very, use the word artificial to me, but I think I agree with you, in combination with the natural experiment. But could you say a little bit more maybe about these lab experiments and I don't know, have you done any in your research? Are they appropriate for this kind of question to study this issue?
Yeah, I mean, well, many of the things he does are actually survey experiments. So the difference is basically the survey experiment, you include it in a regular survey most of the time, and then you just randomize the treatments, and people are not aware of that at all. So they just get different information about something or a different question, and then you basically see how they react differently, but they wouldn't be aware of the fact that they got a different question than somebody else. In a lab, you're basically, actually in a in a situation where you actually are in a specific building, and it's even more difficult than a survey. But you can often do then is you can also observe behavior and things like that. So there are certain advantages to do it in a lab, but again, it makes it more artificial. That's a bit the downside of it. And the thing is, for example, about policies is you can actually maybe study reactions to different policy proposals. Also something you do in some of the experiments. You can confront people with, look, here's this policy, and another group gets another policy, and then you see how people react, and some like this one but not the other one. And you can do all these things, and which you can't do in the real world, because there's only one immigration policy. You cannot say, well, just think of something different now. That's not possible, but you can do it in a survey experiment on a lab setting. And then you can study, how people react differently to one proposal that says we want more high-skilled migrants, and another proposal that says, no, we want to be more open to refugees, for example, and see what people prefer and how they react differently. So that's a big strength of that approach.
Yeah. I think we've talked sufficiently about methods. Perhaps it'll come up in the questions later on or in the discussion, but I wonder if we could circle back to the actual kind of findings and results of the book. And we're here in Göttingen in Germany. Karen, you've also worked on similar questions in the context of Germany. So I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your findings and also how you think they relate to Alex's argumentation in the book.
Yeah, first, I think it's great that you wrote this book, and it's pretty much in the similar intention we had with our project on diversity ascent, that we also looked at the research scenery and thought, okay, everyone has intensively looked at opposition to immigration, which is, of course, an important topic, but it's not all out there. There's also many people who are in favor of diversity to an extent, also people who are in favor of immigration. Maybe we come back to that, but we rarely study that. We kind of take it for granted. Yeah, and it's good that we change that. And we focused in our study, we did German urban context, we focused on what people think about the results of immigration, if you like, so diversity in Germany. And you look more closely at what people think about movement, right? Incoming immigration, new migration. But altogether, we found that in German urban context, where we have a kind of 2/3 majority of people who think that the results of immigration, the diversity arising from that, has been enriching for the society and for individuals. So there is support for the results of immigration. It gets a bit more contested when you ask people, well, are you also willing to support political consequences in the direction of more participation, more equality? Then we get different opinions. Like, people like diverse parliaments, but if you ask them, do you want equal employment policies for the public service, they get a bit more reluctant to support that. So we have a mix of opinions, but I think, I'm fully with Alex in this intention to understand these pro-views a bit better. How do they function? And also think in political terms about, okay, how can we convince more political actors, more media people to do something to strengthen such positive opinions,
Can I actually jump
Absolutely,
in?
yes.
So I think, I'm fully on board with what you guys have done here too. I guess what I worry a little bit, and not just, I'm not just talking about your research, but I think in general is I think sometimes people might not necessarily be realistic about the extent of the support. And I think, especially among folks who study immigration, who are generally more pro-immigration, I think there is a tendency potentially to kind of overestimate the amount of people who can potentially be supportive of immigration and diversity. And so some of it is just, related to just like how we conduct our surveys. I can give you one example completely unrelated from immigration, right? From the study of just social spending in the US and other countries, right? If you just ask people whether they want to increase spending on something, the vast majority are going to say yes to everything. Right, but when you pose certain trade-off, because we know in the real world the governments have a limited budget, right? Then people would start making trade-offs. So I worry a little bit when you just ask people whether they like diversity or not, whether they would be still saying that when you pose a certain trade-off, either the trade-off that actually exists or the trade-off that is currently posed to them in the political discourse. When it comes to immigration, for instance, there is this one survey that was done by Pew Research a couple of years ago where they asked people whether they think immigration is a strength or not. And the vast majority of people around the world said yes, right? And there were a lot of headlines concluding that people actually all pro-immigration everywhere, right? But we know it's a very kind of weak, I would say, kind of socially desirable question, right? And we see in their actually own data in Pew Research, if you kind of zoom in and do some kind of cross-tabulation of people who said, yes, immigration is our strength, and whether they think that it should be increased or decreased, a lot of those people who say immigration is a strength think that it should be decreased, right? Okay. So one way would be to conclude that people are just silly or they don't understand what's going on. But I think what it means is that the world is complex, and people might think that in the abstract, immigration is a good thing, is a strength, but they also are afraid of certain practical challenges that might be faced by their communities if there are too many migrants, right? Mm-hmm. So I think what I would be interested in is kind of figuring out kind of the robustness of some of those results, right? And I can tell you from some of my research that I cite in the book, I can tell you that actually it is true that about 10 to 20% of people across most countries, they support immigration almost unconditionally, right? So as you mentioned, a lot of folks in the academia, they focus on this kind of anti-immigration side, people who are actually racist and vote for radical right-wing parties and all that. And the number of those folks is usually also not more than 20%, right? But I think sometimes we forget that there is also an almost equal number of people who would actually respond positively to almost all questions, right? So they would say that, yes, immigration is a strength, we should invite everyone, there should be no limit, and we should welcome all refugees, right? But I think it's also important to kind of know that, again, at least from my understanding from the data that I've seen, it's almost never more than 20%.
Yeah, but we have very few people who say yes to everything. Actually, people, which is also in a way reassuring that you think people really think about the individual questions, and you get a mix, and they have varying opinions on various questions. But I think altogether, the result that we have about 2/3 with some surveys, you have higher shares even in Germany of people who are positive about diversity in the country, that's pretty sound. You find this in pretty much every survey conducted on the issue. They are not automatically also in favor of increased migration. But we do have some of these questions. I found the Eurobarometer one, 2021, where they ask, do you think immigration from outside the EU even is more of a problem or more of an opportunity for your country? And now, typically, you have a large group of choosing the answer. It's equally a problem and an opportunity. So people go for that middle option if you offer that. In Germany, it was actually 43% going for that. And then you have a division, 27 saying opportunity, 26% saying problem. Yeah, but if you, that's doesn't mean you have harsh majority opposition to immigration altogether, at least, both. It would be silly to say there are no problems involved in immigration. Of course, there's housing issues, there's schools that we have problems dealing with the kids, so, that's a reasonable assumption. So we have that, and we have contradictory opinions, that's... maybe I've been thinking about that. Well, I don't think we should say people are silly, but I wonder, I've read somewhere someone said it's a rationality we as social scientists have is not the same rationality people who answer our surveys have. So for them it's not contradictory.
No.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo this, and maybe first to relate it back to the methodological question, I think one issue is that, at least for a long time, it's changing a bit now, that we often also ask very simplistic questions in surveys. Yeah. So for a long time, we just ask people, do you like to have more or less migration or something like that? And then so that's how we divide the people. And then and now we ask a bit more complex question. And even about policies, you can say, well, I'm in favor or against open policies. But then, a migration policy is not just about opening or closing borders. It's involving a lots of issues of opening it for different groups, then they get the more or less rights, or different kind of combinations of laws. I mean, it's very complex. I mean, there's dozens of different kinds of regulations, and all of them matter. And we don't ask about this because people might be in favor of this law, but only under the circumstance that something else also is happening. And if something else is not happening, then they would be against it. So they have all these what we call in the project we have like conditional support. They say, well, I'm in favor of this open policy, but only if they don't stay too long, or in favor of this, but only if they also get the same rights as natives, and all these kind of combinations. And it shows you how complex these opinions are. On the one hand, at the same time, it also shows you, and this is also what is shown in this book, it also shows you how, that certain compromises are possible, and then people are also willing to accept more or fewer immigrants, and if you provide certain other laws. So they're not just against or in favor of something. And that shows you how willing people are to change opinions and to adapt, and that's the good news. And that's also something that comes out in this book, which is maybe also in a way limitation. Obviously, you cannot do everything in this book, but that okay, you show that if people benefit from it, especially economically, and policies attract high-skilled migrants, they're in favor of it. But if you would tell people also, well, but they're coming with their families, they will stay a long time, they will use, they also use the infrastructure in your countries. Once people also realize that, and if you provide that kind of information, would they still be, in favor of these policies? And that would be like the next step to see, when they are aware of all the implications, what would happen then?
I can answer that actually. Yeah. So kind of my main goal is actually in what I call kind of demonstrably beneficial policies. Then the idea is that people are not going to turn against them even if they're aware of all the implications, right? And I would say kind of the most prototypically popular policies that is really popular across all possible contexts and countries and years that I'm aware of is the admission of highly skilled migrants, right? And what's fascinating about this to me is that it really doesn't matter how you phrase the question, right? Whether you pose a certain trade-off, whether you compare it to low-skilled immigrants or just migrants in general or humanitarian immigration, it seems that really the vast majority of voters are all okay with inviting more skilled migrants. There was a Pew poll just before the US election in November 2024, where they found that both people who identify as a Trump supporter and a Harris supporter were 90% supportive of increasing high-skilled immigration, right? So despite the fact, again, that the vast majority of Trump voters are not on board with the existing immigration policy in the abstract and are opposed to immigration in general, they were still were willing to support increase of skilled immigration. And I think what, Marc, you were alluding to, which I think is very important, is this idea of conditional preferences, right? And I actually was very much inspired by Marc research in this regard, right? I think some of it is about changing minds, but some of it is about actually meeting people where they are, right? Actually figuring out under what conditions they would actually be supportive of some policies, but not others. Like sometimes, I can tell you in the US context, we would see a very simple survey where they ask about people's support for pathway to citizenship for undocumented migrants, and whether people want to increase or decrease immigration. And then a lot of people, we see that they are supportive of the pathway to citizenship, right? At the same time want to decrease immigration. And a lot of experts would tell you that people are just confused, right? But actually, as you find in your German survey, right, it's a very meaningful preference that people have, that they want to secure the access and the rights of people who are already here who are already part of their communities, right? Even if you're a conservative person who is generally opposed to immigration, you can still acknowledge that an undocumented person who is a part of your community, they are still already there, right? And we need to provide them with some help and make sure that they're productive members of society, right? So those folks can still be supportive of pathway to citizenship under certain conditions, right? Not just give away green cards or whatnot, right? But maybe they have to pay a fine or something, but still they can legalize, right? But at the same time, they might still not be on board with increasing immigration levels, right? Because they have concerns about fiscal drain, about cultural assimilation or whatever have you, right? And I don't think it means that people are confused or their minds cannot be changed, but I think instead of just dismissing those people as anti-immigrant or confused, I think we should listen to them and actually figure out a way how they can be on board with where other people are.
And because this idea of demonstrably beneficial is very central to the book, right? And you say that these beneficial policies cannot simply be described as such by politicians. They actually need to be proven to be beneficial. So, but how would you do this? And are there any examples of where this has succeeded in the world?
So I would say yes. So this is a kind of one of the central intervention that, at least the way I think about what I have in the book, is this idea of demonstrably beneficial policies. And there, so I define those policies as a subset of policies that deemed beneficial by the experts, right? Okay. But also the policies that are explicitly beneficial to receiving countries in terms of their intent, and also straightforwardly or intuitively beneficial, so that people, even those who have less education, even those who are conservative, can understand why they're good for them without being told. Right? And again, this kind of idea of skilled immigration, the reason why it's so popular is exactly because most people agree that, you know, those folks come here, they advance the receiving country, they pay taxes, and usually they have very little concerns about their language acquisition, cultural assimilation and integration and things like that, right? But what I also show is that it's not just about attracting the best and the brightest. So one example that I really like is this immigration of immediate relatives, for instance, right? Chain immigration, so-called, can become controversial and people can oppose to it, right? But I think most people in the US and many other countries too, they truly believe that, citizens, native-born citizens, have full rights to invite foreign spouses, right? Because these are their loved ones. Right, and right now, the immigration of immediate relatives is actually pretty convoluted in most contexts, right? And I have some survey experiments that show that, when people learn about how convoluted it is, how much it costs in terms of visa fees or just like, legal fees and stuff like that, even folks who are currently conservative and opposed to immigration are actually willing to change their mind a little bit and say that maybe, legal immigration should be streamlined a little bit and simplified, right? Because I think people just don't realize the restrictiveness of the current status quo, right? I think that's kind of another thing that I really lean heavily in the book, is that, I think it's important for everyone to realize that the current immigration policy, despite the headlines of open borders, is actually very, very restricted, right? For most people in the world, it's impossible to migrate to any of the immigrant receiving countries, right? And so to the extent that we want to discourage undocumented or illegal immigration and encourage legal and productive immigration, I think it's important to ensure that those pathways are out there.
I agree with everything. I think that's very convincing in many ways. The only problem we have a little bit is there's very few cases where we actually do observe what happens if a lot of high-skilled migrants actually arrive. So that's what we all want to have. I mean, everybody prefers high-skilled migrants. But what actually happens if this really is the major group that comes? Because there are also some examples that show it might also go wrong. And maybe once people realize what is happening, they're not always that enthusiastic about it. There's one famous American study that's like 15, 20 years ago, where people, was it in the Silicon Valley, have been asked about, how they feel about more high-skilled IT persons. And there was some opposition. I don't remember all the details. So that would be a typical case where there's only high-skilled people among high-skilled people, and some of the high-skilled natives are actually quite opposed to that idea because they've all of a sudden they felt threatened because they don't feel threatened about low-skilled, Hispanics, but they might feel threatened by high-skilled IT people. Another case I know very well because I've worked on a long time ago is German migration to Switzerland.
Yeah,
so that's a typical case. I know because I'm originally from Switzerland. There's a lot of German migration to Switzerland. These are the ideal migrants, you would say. They look the same. They speak. I mean, the Swiss would say a different language, but it's I would say still a rather close language. Most of them are high skilled, and they're clearly needed because otherwise they wouldn't arrive. And there's a lot of controversies has been ongoing for a while in Switzerland about them. I mean, these just individual, examples, but still show that that it again more complicated sometimes than we think.
Yeah.
So but of course, this is still something we need to research on.
Very
okay, very briefly, and I think Karen
yeah,
also wants to jump in.
I'm going to concede, actually, if anything, that would just strengthen the point of my book, is that so we can never make all immigration popular and bring everyone on our side, right? You will always have, costs and benefits, and some people will be naturally opposed even to the most beneficial migration out there just because it's against their own interests from what we see in some of those studies. I guess for me, the point is that it's, it doesn't get better than that, right? So, even, again, in the US with the high-skilled immigration, we saw that if you zoom into the Republican coalition of nativists and some kind of fiscal conservatives, there was, a very strong opposition recently to H-1B tech visas, even though normally they're pretty popular, right? So, you would have, so I fully concede that even high-skilled immigration can face opposition, right? But it's hard for me to imagine anything that's more popular than that still.
Yeah. Karen?
Yeah, I mean, what I take as a main message is that opinions on immigration are heterogeneous, and we're well advised to look at the differences in what people believe. Yeah, then another question is, well, can we actually help to improve communication about what's happening? But on what people believe, I take as the most important thing that usually majorities are in favor of control. I'm not sure they're always in favor of decreasing immigration. I mean, I just looked at something recent, Ipsos here for Britain, where there has been a harsh anti-immigration propaganda over many years, and it's just 52% they're saying that they are in favor of decreasing, but this has been varying, between 40-something and 60-something over the past few years. So, but like when you look at Germany, I think you mostly find people are in favor of control or regulation, whatever you call it, even for the EU, where it does not exist. So people are not very realistic, and you could say, okay, but hasn't been a political issue. So that may be another question. It does not always become a political problem that people demand control, or when asked, say, even EU labor migration should be regulated, which is not. But on the other side, the skilled, is it really true that it's always and everywhere the skilled immigrants who enjoy most popularity? I think I remember, like German surveys over the years, you often had high support for refugee immigration if people are described as victims of political persecution or wars. You have higher support sometimes than even for labor migration. And this British survey, I've just found this Ipsos survey, it's the same survey. They ask people, you have a majority say decrease. And then they ask them about particular groups. They say, what about nurses? What about doctors? What about care home workers? What about fruit pickers? What about teachers? What about construction laborers? And various other groups. And for all these groups, people say, no, rather increase. They want them. So once you get specific, and I'm not sure that academics are the highest here. I think I just see them on the same level as restaurant and catering staff. Lorry drivers, Bankers are not so popular. It's about even. They're least popular, but why would you bring in bankers? I mean, that's a silly question. But otherwise, yeah, you make people think of something specific, needed people. Yeah, and then it may be the fruit pickers that are obviously needed, or the plumber in Britain, because everyone needs them and everyone knows about nurses, doctors, and they may be popular, not necessarily whatever highly skilled means. I mean, skilled, means just with some qualification and some use to the economy. I mean, that's the point.
Yeah, I would say so. Again, just getting a little bit into the weeds here, I think as you mentioned, so, humanitarian migration can be popular, but you really have to do it in a way that people would accept it. I think oftentimes when we see that it's popular, as you said, it has to be this condition that those are vulnerable people in need. And so a lot of the narratives that exist, which again, maybe more or less realistic, would say that actually those are true economic migrants that are just masquerading as refugees. Right.
Then it gets tricky. Then people's opinions turn. If you say they are not really persecuted, they just come for economic reasons, then
And we have this very interesting individuating effect where, people are willing to accept any particular individual, especially if they're in need, right? But when it comes to setting immigration policy, where you would have to accept hundreds and thousands, then the opinions can be somewhat different, right? I think oftentimes when we analyze those so-called conjoined experiments, where basically people are put in the position of an immigration officer, where they have to pick between two migrants, and we can randomly vary various characteristics and see what people prefer. Usually, skills pop up as this kind of main driving factor, but also that people are usually more willing to accept refugees. But I personally think that oftentimes this finding can be misleading because, in the real world, no one is actually picking between two migrants, right? Immigration policy is not decided this way. And obviously, if you have to pick between like a random worker and a person who is fleeing conflict and they're in dire need, right? You might go with the person who is fleeing conflict, right? But in the real world, what we see, just evidently from people's backlashes in reaction to real world policies, right, is that the vast majorities are very much against, significant asylum immigration that is not based on some kind of needs or skills or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly. So one issue is, again, if we ask in the abstract, then people are often in favor of refugees and more than labor migrants. But then the question is, what happens when actually a lot of them arrive? And that's exactly what you observe in Germany, for example. People were quite welcoming for a long time and got more critical after a while, at least for some migrants, and then varies across refugee groups, which is also quite interesting. And that's also, I did once a survey on climate change refugees. So we know very little of how would these people be welcomed. And they're actually quite welcomed in the survey because the argument there is also they have a legitimate reason to leave. They have no choice. But once you tell them, we did this in a vignette study, once you tell them, well, many will arrive, then they get more critical. And if you tell them, well, only some will arrive, because most of them will stay in the global south anyway, then people are very much in favor. So once they realize that many will come, then so this also plays a role. And that's exactly what we also observe in Germany what we have observed over the last years, that as soon as people get the impression that it gets out of control, and that's again your argument, then that plays a big role. So they may be in favor of refugees, but as long as we some have a control over how many are arriving at which time, etc. So this also plays an important role.
Yeah, I think control is very important, and I mean some of my colleagues in the U.S. even have this kind of idea of the so-called chaos theory, that everything that is determinative of immigration policy is all about whether people perceive some kind of chaos or not, right? And I think oftentimes there is this kind of belief that is common among academics is that, it's all just made up, right? So populists, they just like shout, oh, there is chaos, there is crisis, and it kind of, the voters are just like blindly buying it, right? I think the reality is much more complicated than that. Of course, a lot of problems are exaggerated, right? But I think we cannot just easily dismiss them. And there are certainly ways and measures how various governments can actually improve the sense of control, right? And we actually saw it in Sweden, where obviously people were extremely welcoming in the very beginning of the Syrian war. They accepted more folks than in Germany, even on the per capita basis, right? But then the kind of attitudes have become more negative, and so the governments had to impose this additional border checks and stuff that was eventually they were able to kind of reduce some of those negative attitudes. So I think it's not just about, just the rhetoric, right? I think it's also important to see what's happening on the ground and how we actually manage our immigration policies, right? Because I think oftentimes people don't realize just the sheer vastness of chaos that is happening, right? So I, again, just give you the most recent example. In the US, recently we accepted the biggest number of inflows of migrants, both in the absolute and the relative sense, after the start of the pandemic. And a lot of pro-immigration advocates have been denying this for a long time until the census updated their estimates. And now we know there was 7 million people, right? And so it's not just misinformation that people were responding to. It was an actual sheerness and the vastness of inflows, which I think is not something you can easily dismiss.
Yeah. And I mean, we just talked about these different types of migration. Again, your book is mostly about high-skilled labor migration, but you also mentioned humanitarian migration. And when you actually, if I remember correctly, say in the book that although you focus on how to make high-skilled labor migration popular, you actually think it's going to have or can have kind of spillover effects almost on the popularity of other types of migration. Can you maybe explain that a little bit? Because I think this is something that, starting to read the book, I wondered, but what about other migrants? There aren't just high-skilled labor migrants in the world.
Yeah, so I don't think we need to make high-skilled immigration popular. It's already popular.
It is popular, yeah.
I think it creates some tension in some very, specific circumstances that Marc mentioned, but I think in general, I don't think that's an issue. And, if you look at actually what radical right-wing parties are talking about, they never talk about skilled migration, right? They are on board with it. They never do anything good for it. They never streamline or propose any actually policies that would make it easier, right? But they never oppose it because they understand that it's not going to be resonating with anyone, right? But yeah, so there are two answers to what you're talking about, because I'm also not satisfied with the idea that only the best and the brightest can get in, right? So first of all, as you mentioned, we clearly see those positive spillover effects, right? Let's take Canada, right? Is this most prototypical system with a point-based system where anyone here in the audience or on YouTube, right, you can just go on the government website, fill in your demographic information, like the languages you speak, your education, and you can see whether you actually qualify for some kind of permanent residency there or not. Very easy, very transparent, very selective, right, which some people might feel uncomfortable with, right? But I think the result of it, at least according to kind of my conclusion, is that Canada is able to admit and absorb so many migrants of all kinds. So in a way, they can afford to admit a lot of refugees and asylum seekers too, right? Because people in general, despite some recent setbacks, they have trust in the government to manage their immigration system and their interest, right? And again, it's not just economic benefits. I think we see here in Europe, with the fact how welcoming people were toward Ukrainian refugees, right? It wasn't just because of the economic benefits that Ukrainian refugees can bring. I think a lot of it was about the sense of national security, right? Because people rightly see Russia as a geopolitical enemy, right? And so the only way for them to stick it to Russia is to admit Ukrainian refugees, right? And I think this is a very important motivation for a lot of people to be welcoming, right? I think obviously there was a lot of racism, you can say, right? And a lot of articles have been already written about that, but I think this geopolitical national interest component cannot be dismissed either.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about Canada throughout the book as a very positive, if not the only positive example in the world. So I just wonder, if it's so straightforward, demonstrably beneficial, like why have so few countries successfully implemented demonstrably beneficial policies? Why is it such a rare case, Canada?
Yeah, and just if I could go back a little bit. And so, so there you have positive spillover effects. And another thing is that demonstrably beneficial policies are policies, right? It's not about the worth of individuals, right? And just to give an example, right, we can imagine hypothetical semi-skilled person in Syria, let's say a plumber or carpenter, right, whose labor might be needed in Germany or other European countries, right? And so this person, let's say, if they hypothetically have a choice between coming to Germany by claiming asylum or in a work visa, the work visa route is going to be much more demonstrably beneficial that more people are going to be able to accept pretty easily, right? The problem right now is that in the real world, that person might not actually have a legal pathway to come, right? So their only choice is to claim asylum, right? And I think that's what creates a lot of problems. And I can tell you the most demonstrably harmful policy that I'm aware of, and which still happens in many places, and I know it happened in Germany, is that when governments accept asylum seekers, but they don't allow them to work. Right? It's by design, right? Without any rhetoric, right? No one is doing any messaging, right? You invite people and you don't allow them to provide for themselves. Of course, it's going to create those perceptions that they're not contributing to receiving society, right? So I think that's kind of where the problem can start.
And just to return to the question, like, why are positive examples of this so far and few between? Like, why have so few politicians successfully implemented these policies?
Yeah, I mean, this is,
or
really
demonstrated them to be beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, this is really good. I mean, I think it's widely acknowledged that Canada is certainly doing something right. I think you can clearly see, even in Sweden, right, they have done a lot of delegations. They have sent their immigration policymakers to Canada to learn about their experience, right? Canada has clearly, been used as this kind of design kind of prototype for other countries, right? A lot of other countries adopted some kind of version of point-based system, sometimes with more, sometimes with less success. We know the UK, for instance, have tried to adopt some kind of point-based system 3 times with very little success, right? But other countries have been much more successful in that. Canada, again, it's not a coincidence that even when it comes to, again, humanitarian migration, which according to my evidence is usually less popular, right? Canadians have spearheaded this idea of private refugee sponsorship, right, which is very successful. It's basically the idea when private citizens and permanent residents, sometimes they can individually or in groups sponsor people from abroad to come, and they kind of cover for them and make sure that they're like integrated and provided for, and they kind of take some responsibility for them. And again, if you're like a nativist who opposes immigration, it's really hard to argue against that, because again, it's your own compatriots are basically willing to take responsibility for others and invite them, right? I think, in the US, we often had this kind of knee-jerk reaction from nativists that, if you're like so humanitarian and you support immigration, just invite them to your house, right? I mean, it sounds like a very convincing argument, but the truth is that in most countries in the world, as far as I'm aware, you are not allowed to bring anyone from abroad because the government bans you from doing that. I don't think in Germany you can just invite a refugee to your house, right? From anywhere, right? You have to go through some kind of...
I mean, we do have programs, but maybe not quite like in Canada,
Yeah, and so I think a lot of governments who are currently considering doing something like in Canada, I think they're doing a right thing. And again, it's not a coincidence that the Canadians have come up with this, not the people in Sweden who, had this kind of much more humanitarian system.
Come in. I mean, I'm not sure about your argument. I would say, like in Germany, immigration is beneficial to the country, current immigration. That's true for labor immigration, that's true for refugee immigration. It's pretty clear that demographically Germany needs that input, and even, I mean, there's these studies done by IAB, DITSIM, that show that after a couple of years, refugees become beneficial in terms of they pay more into the public funds, taxes and social security than they've taken out before. It just needs a couple of years. So it's immigration is demonstrably beneficial as it is in this current mix. So the question is, why is this not demonstrated? Or how do we demonstrate that? And does public opinion really respond to, these factual development and to policies? Or are the people right who say it's actually has little to do with immigration itself? Public opinion rather responds to public debates and media currents, like I'm sure the work of Christian Schimara together with Schmidt-Katran, they argue that it has little to do with these factual developments, it's rather debates about immigration. I mean, that would be one point. The other point is what I would like to talk about is this control issue. I mean, you emphasize this pretty much. People are in favor of control, that is true. But I think control over immigration doesn't exist and can't be promised. in particular not in the European Union. So it's extremely dangerous, yeah. Also, I mean, Britain, it has been a disaster, yeah, to promise control over immigration. And in fact, immigration has gone up. So just, I mean, politicians dig their own graves by promising that. So I think that we should not recommend that. We should recommend just openness. I think it would be better to be honest about it. I mean, they're afraid of that, politicians, to be honest and say, no, most of immigration to Germany is not controlled because it's EU immigration, actually. Yeah, so, and that's fine, it works, yeah, so why be worried about it? Yeah, so we have a problem there, that people want control over their lives. Okay, difficult to grant in this world.
We'll have to be rather brief in order to get to the questions, but maybe you can respond.
Yeah, brief. So, yeah, that's an important point. The question is what control really means. So, that different aspects. Maybe I also wanted to say something about Canada. I mean, Canada obviously has some advantages geographically. So, it's easy to control because, you know, it's just far away from all the regions where the refugees are. So, they're in better control, like in the literal sense of the word, than Germany. And other, so, that's an advantage. And then there's also the language advantage, I think, to attract high-skilled migrants if you speak English instead of German. That, you know, that all these advantages, and it shows up in your book that it's especially the English-speaking countries that actually seem to drive some of the results in the upper right corner of some of your tables. So I think that also plays a role. And then, you know, what control, I think, does not necessarily mean that we decide how many people come at which time. It also means that people get the impression that the government actually knows what they do and have at least a clear policy. I think that's also part of what I understand under control, and not just we close the border, we don't close the border, but we actually know what we do. And that's a big problem in Germany, because in many ways, I would say it should be a case that confirms your case, because there has been a new policy since a couple of years, has been reformed a couple of times, like similar to the point system, to attract more high-skilled migrants. So according to your argument, that migration should be more popular. Of course, it probably needs some more time to show its effects. But why does it not happen? Because there's the refugee issue, and especially the populist right, like in many countries, that, you know, clearly instrumentalizes this issue and pushes all the party in the same direction, and all the other parties, they only react to that. They don't propose their own view of what they want to have as a policy. And for example, nobody talks about this point system. Nobody talks about the liberalized naturalization policy, all these liberalization policies that we have observed that have, you know, encountered some opposition for a very short time, but everybody only talks about deportation, refugees, which are clearly, you know, important issues. And this is all driven by the right-wing populist parties, and all the other parties, instead of proposing something different, they basically just all go into the same direction because they fear to lose even more voters, which then actually happens because research has shown that if they move to the right, then this is even more disastrous for the moderate parties, because the right-wing populists will profit from that. So, you know, this is clearly the wrong strategy of these parties, because they could take advantage of all these other policies to actually show how beneficial migration could actually be, but they don't.
Yeah,
So
very
why-
briefly.
Cut the conversation short. Yeah, we want to get to the questions, but do you want to very briefly
Yeah, very
answer?
briefly.
Okay.
So even though I say that it's the policies that matter, not just rhetoric, but rhetoric does matter, right? If you do something that is actually popular and good, but no one knows about it, that's also not great, right? And then, you know, for it to be demonstrably beneficial, it has to take time. And my understanding of the skilled immigration reform, which I mentioned in the book, it's a good idea, but so far Germany has not been able to attract that many people, you know, and partially because of those, you know, just people, those who are highly skilled and educated usually go to Canada and the US.
But it's skilled, not high skilled. I mean, it's now even vocational skills.
Okay, I would say that we stop here and maybe see if there are any questions from the audience. I know there's one question from online. Maybe Nicolas, you could go first, and in the meantime, yeah.
So I have a question from Peter. Alexander said promoting migration not just a liberal aim. Conservatives gain when their policies are received. That was a point you made at the very beginning. So why should conservative or anti-migration voices bother to promote migration, and what is in it for them?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, like, you really want your own policies to be popular, right? So, like, we see, for instance, again, just thinking about the most recent development in the Trump administration, right? For many years, conservatives and Republicans had an advantage on the immigration issue, right? In terms of kind of voter trust and their kind of perceptions of competence, right? And what we see Trump has done single-handedly is basically he lost this advantage. Right now, if you look at the polls, immigration is still the most advantaged issue of the current administration, right? But it's not positive anymore, right? And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, the Trump administration thought that they would have a public mandate to do a lot of the stuff that they're doing in terms of executive orders and mass deportation, right? But I think a lot of people, even those who are skeptical of immigration, they haven't really signed up for what they're seeing right now, right? No one has signed up for just mindless deportation of random productive people to, high security prison in El Salvador, right, with no due process, right? That's not what conservatives are standing for, right? So I think in this sense, obviously if you were just like an anti-immigration party and that's the only message you can have, certainly you can imagine how, just demonizing migrants and not doing anything about the issue can be your winning strategy, right? But to a certain extent, when it comes to kind of more mainstream parties or when you want to reach the majority, right, that's never going to be a good strategy because, most people are not like that, right? Most people, again, they conditionally support immigration that is well-managed, controlled, and beneficial, right? And as Karen pointed out, right, a lot of immigration is actually beneficial according to the estimates of the expert, right? The problem is to make sure that people can see it too. And I think unfortunately, when it comes to humanitarian migration, it really depends on the context whether it's truly beneficial or not, as we know.
Thanks, Alex. I saw Steve has a question, and then...
Steve Herdevik, also from the Max Planck Institute here. First, thanks for a great discussion. I'd like to ask the panel to address, by way of all these issues, migration and attitudes and so forth, a seeming dichotomy, and that's between the local and the national level. So on the one hand, economists always will tell us that the costs of migration are borne locally and the benefits are nationally, i.e. locally, people have to pay for schools, housing, healthcare, public programs, public spaces, and so forth, and that really costs something socially and financially. And that the benefits to labor market, to GDP, fiscally, are on the national level, just saying what a lot of economists will say. And then on the other hand, I know research that suggests that when asked about the migration in their local community, people will say, no, here things are actually okay in my city or town. On the national level, it's a disaster, though. And so when people are asked to move from their experience to a kind of abstract or imagined level, imagined community, the nation state, that's where they think things are bad. So what does the panel think by way of policy or other kinds of campaigns or programs, how to improve and bring about a more positive set of attitudes that sort of bridges this local-national dichotomy? Or do you think that this dichotomy itself is false?
I can answer to that. I would, disagree with the premise of the question, but I would reinterpret it in a way that it's in line with what I'm thinking. So I think what we know from a lot of public opinion research is that people's attitudes are sociotropic. So meaning that people care about what's happening with their country, not necessarily themselves personally, or even their local community. And that's what we see happens a lot with immigration too, right? In the U.S., just a very funny fact is that if you look at the public opinion, attitudes toward immigration across different states, people in Wyoming, of all places, are going to be most concerned about immigration, also most negative about immigration. And again, some academics, not all, would say that, oh, look, people are confused or silly, right? It's all brainwashing by Fox News, right? But to the extent that you believe that attitudes are sociotropic and people care about, beyond their self-interest and what's happening with their country that they care about, I think that kind of makes perfect sense, right? I think the problem that I see, which kind of relates to what you're talking about, is that oftentimes the benefits of immigration are invisible, not necessarily because they're federal versus local, but because they're kind of counterfactual and seen, right? So, when businesses hire workers and everything works, no one sees that. Everyone assumes it's normal, right? When something happens right now, with the tariffs, for instance, or, with some immigration restrictions, when those businesses close down, we don't necessarily associate it with immigration, right? So people kind of don't see the benefits of some of those policies that already exist, right? But when costs happen, let's say when you have a high-profile murder or a crime committed by an immigrant, right? There's a lot of kind of concentration frustration on this particular instance, right? Even though we know from the US evidence, for instance, that most migrants, regardless of their status, are much less likely to commit any kind of crime, right? So you have this kind of problem of kind of concentrated benefits or like, kind of diffuse benefits, but concentrated costs that are very visible oftentimes.
Maybe just to add to this, so I mean, there's this issue that, especially in Germany, we talk a lot about this, that obviously people are, placed in a certain place, but who pays for that? And there's a discussion about, federal money that should flow into these states or local communities, and there's negotiations that have been going on, for a while, for a long time. And of course, then more money is needed probably, and then this at least solves some of the problems. But this is. At the same time, I would also say there's at least some research I know from economists that shows that even at the local level, local municipalities might profit a lot economically from refugees, even if they don't pay taxes, because they need to be housed and fed and integrated, and this also creates jobs in local businesses that work for these refugee centers, for example. At some point, refugees also start their own businesses and start to work. So there's some research that shows at least that they might also benefit from it locally. I think that's an issue. But the bigger issue is, of course, the question of solidarity among different units, and be it local and national, and we have the same discussion at the EU level, that some states have to provide resources for other states who have more refugees, like in the south of Europe, for example, and are they willing to pay for that or not? And that's the ongoing solidarity discussion, that why should I pay for them when I'm I don't know, far away from the southern border and not affected by that? And that's the same thing going on between local and federal level. So do we have this solidarity or don't we have that? That's the big question.
Karen, do you want to add anything?
Only if there's not more.
No, I saw Ulrike has a question, right?
Yeah, let's have another question first.
Hello, my name is Ulrike. I'm a visitor here at the Institute. My question, like we talked a bit about the demonstrably beneficial, but there was another kind of paired notion with the self-interest, or the well-understood self-interest, and it just got me thinking, with other people keep on eating red meat, keep on smoking, driving their diesel cars. Also, I guess climate catastrophe is not in each of our personal interest, nor the generalizable interest. So it's perhaps a war or something like this. So I'm wondering, is the answer always there should be better policies to make people aware of not flying, not driving diesel cars, or smoking, etc. So or how is this different? How is this topic different than all these other things that are also obviously not in our self-interest or generalizable self-interest? And a question that comes with this is whose interest also in the title? Is it our interest? Because in some parts of the conversation you talked about natives, and I wondered is it, some people would say everybody's a migrant in one way or the other. So whose self-interest, and how is this interest understood via the other hot topics? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, no, this is a great question. I think you can think of it in the following ways. So people are not informed about most policy issues, right? I think in this sense, I think you're right, immigration is nothing special, actually. One way to actually reinterpret the message of my book is that immigration should be the same as everything else. What people want from immigration is exactly what they want from any other public policy, right? Just to have the broad public interest in mind, right? To have a programmatic policy that benefits the current residents that currently live in the country, right? And obviously people might disagree about who is a part of their national community. I think that's what you were alluding to, right? So obviously if you talk to some kind of more nativist people, they would say, of course, it's just the native-born people of the ethnic majority and that's it, right? But I think a lot of people would concede that there's a lot of gray areas, right? And a lot of people in the US, we know, even those, again, who are more conservative would acknowledge that people who are undocumented right now, they would still be at least partially a part of their community, right? So it's not either or, it's a spectrum, right? And I think another thing that you mentioned, which I think is very important, is that self-interest, like anything else, it can be mistaken, right? So people might believe that they're doing what's good for them, right? But they might be wrong, right? Just because their facts are wrong, right? And so in this sense, I think it's very important to kind of go back to this idea of enlightened self-interest by Adam Smith, right? And we can also think of more enlightened national interest, right? In the same exact vein. I think the problem oftentimes with so-called self-proclaimed nationalists, right, is that they claim to maximize national interest and do what's good for their country, but reality, as we see right now with a lot of those parties and politicians, is that the actual outcomes are not indicative of that, right? So I think it's a matter not of just saying that what we do is good for our people, which usually again narrowly defined, right? But actually look at what the actual outcomes are on the ground, right? So the in the very beginning of my book, right, the dedication, right, it says for the love of country and cost-benefit analysis, right? So I think we really, what we should start with, right, is with determining what policies are actually better for receiving countries, right? The actually beneficial policies that people would agree on, the expert would agree on, and then try to identify the policies that voters are going to be able to see as beneficial too, right? Well, that's kind of the challenge, right? But I think oftentimes we start with policies that are just broadly popular with some, base of a certain party, right? And in the end, we don't really see good outcomes, and in the end, it's not good for anyone.
Well, yeah, Marc, you go first.
No, I think that's a really crucial question. It's not only, I think, there's two aspects to it. It's whose interests, but also which interests. So whose interests, that's maybe also a bit a limitation of that, or something that we could dig into even more is, you mostly talk about the interests of the people and the people of a country and how they think about immigration policies. But of course, as we know from a lot of research, there are different groups, even among the natives, like how do high-skilled people react, and in contrast to low-skilled people or more or less nativist people, and they react differently to these different policies. That we know that basically everybody is in favor of high-skilled migration, but of course to different degrees. And so that's something we should also look at to see and who is more convinced by these policies. Some will be more convinced than other people. So I think that's a crucial question. But then it's the question also of which interests, in the sense of, in the book it's mostly about, what we talk about here is mostly about more material interests in the sense of economic aspects. But of course there are some more normative interests that some people just don't want to live in a diverse community, no matter what. And some other people absolutely want to live in a diverse community, no matter what, and they're even willing to pay somehow for it. So, I mean, there are also these normative cultural interests that play a role. And the other thing, why do people, behave against their interests? Well, the problem is they have many interests. It might be in our interest to save the climate, but it's also in my interest to see the world. So one leads to taking a plane, and the other one takes not to take a plane. And then, at some moment, one interest is bigger than the other interest, and at another point, it's vice versa. So even the very same person has different interests, and that's why it makes it so complicated. And it's well.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about whether you can actually compare your individual smoking habits with your attitudes to immigration, or whether that's a different thing, how you assess your benefits. I find it quite important, or something encouraging I learned in the studies we've done here, that actually I think there's not that many people who are very narrow-minded just about economic self-interest, right? I mean, we have, for instance, surveyed urban actors in another study, or leading people in various social functions at the urban level. And the encouraging thing was that very often people say, yes, immigration also causes problems. We're worried about the housing situation, overburdened health service, schools being crowded, but we are still in favor of migration, because not only we need it economically, we need it for our population structure. They also say, because my city has become far more interesting, in terms of shopping, but also culturally. Often they say politically this has beneficial effects, because we counter extreme right tendencies. The city has become more tolerant, and I like that. Yeah, so people, I think quite a number of people are not so narrow-minded just about money. Of course, it depends on whether you have some or you don't. Yeah, it's a luxury to have other interests as well. But I think even people who don't earn enormous salaries may value culturally diverse city as the more livable environment. And we can, the question is, well, I think I lean more towards rhetoric or selling policy, or I tend to think you can't separate it. Having a good policy and also selling it. And we've seen in the past in Germany that you could gain majorities for migration, and you can also lose them when you have a predominant public discourse that sends the message, it's all a problem, or that does not send any message at all, and allows then the perception of overburdened social services and crime. I think crime is really the key issue. Also with your Swedish example, what really broke it there, I think, is crime and the debates about immigration causing a danger to the lives of people. I mean, then it really gets tricky if that message comes across. Of course, a wrong message, but fear of crime, I mean, that's well known that people are completely irrational about crime, and there's very little that can be done about it. People tend to completely overrate the threat of being attacked at night or whatever it is.
We have at least 2 more questions from the audience. So Jamila first.
I'm Jamila Hamidou. I'm a postdoc here at Max Planck Institute. Thank you so much for this conversation. Being someone of a migrant descent as well, it's quite interesting to hear different perspectives from the US, from Germany, but also from Sweden. So what it's just a comment, but perhaps a question as well. I wanted to find out, because from what I'm hearing, it sounds like skilled migrants versus refugees, and what can the migrant bring? But it sounds like the migrant has become an object and not a subject. So how can you address that? Because it's all about what can we get from the migrant as an object. A skilled migrant can bring a lot on the table. A refugee can also bring a lot to the community because they will be housed, the businesses can benefit from them. So it reduces, for me, from how I'm understanding, that the migrant has become an object. And not a center as a subject. So how can you address that? Thank you.
I hear you, and actually I was also going to respond to what Karen said. I think it's important for all of us here realize that there's definitely a diversity of opinion in the general population, right? So as you rightly mentioned, some people are willing to withstand certain economic cost because they think that immigration brings some cultural benefits, but we also see a lot of situations on the opposite. And, in fact, we have studies where people acknowledge that immigration actually of all kinds brings some economic benefit, but they don't want to have it because of some cultural issues. They just don't want to see people or hear different languages, right? So we have some differences in opinion on that, which I don't think are going to be easy to reconcile, right? And I think the question of whether migrants themselves are subjects or objects, right, for, again, a lot of people out there in the world, right, that's not a question at all, right? What they want to hear and see is no immigration whatsoever, right? And a lot of people are in between and they're skeptical, right? And what I want to say and what I want to do in my book is to make the world more open, right? And again, the status quo right now is extremely restrictive everywhere, right? And to that end, I think it might be a little bit too costly to be idealistic, right? Because again, you cannot just convince certain folks, right? They have different concerns and they have different ideas about immigration, right? And by putting immigrants before the natives is just not going to be something that's going to fly with the majority of voters in any context that I'm aware of, right? So in a lot of the experiments that I've done, right, I showed that those humanitarian motivations, they're absolutely real, right, and there might be extremely widespread in the audience like this among pro-immigration advocates and scholars, right, but if we zoom into the general population, it's never more than 10 to 20%, right? What it means is that you cannot build a pro-immigration political coalition by relying on those humanitarian motivations and by putting immigrants first, right? Even actually people who have humanitarian motivations, I find they are not willing to benefit migrants at the expense of natives, right? They might acknowledge that immigration is beneficial, right? But they are also not, not fully willing to sacrifice, let's say, economic growth or certain kind of public benefits of their local community for immigrant help, right? So I think it's just, again, you might disagree with this normatively, but I think it's important to kind of acknowledge the reality of actually existing restrictive immigration policies and actually existing restrictive public opinion.
Let's take in maybe another question.
We have another question from the online audience.
Yeah, so Alex, drawing on your book, which 5 ideas could Germany apply to build wider public support for migration? And an easy one. And then Marc and Karen, which lessons from the book do you see as most relevant for Germany or for the EU? Also easy.
Yeah, so and I should, acknowledge and start with the fact that I'm not an expert in German immigration policy, but from what I hear, and it's something that Marc alluded to, that any of the skilled immigration reform that recently happened and the citizenship reforms, I think these are all really good productive policies that are going to make immigration better in Germany, and I think in the long term are definitely going to make it popular. I think what Germany has to kind of go away from, and it's something that we recently heard from actually Karen, your new research, right? The fact that we see that here in Germany and many other European countries, the openness that we did have, it was totally accidental, or at least, semi-planned in a way, right? So it was not something that anyone designed, right? It's not something that people can perceive as, being under control, right? So if we just look at the composition of the most recent inflows in Germany, according to my best understanding, right, it's still mostly dominated by humanitarian migrants and their relatives of various kinds, right? You do have sort of a lot of migration from inside the EU, right? But it's obviously framed in a way that is not considered to be a part of kind of international migration for many different reasons, right? And so I think to the extent that migration is dominated by non-work migration, it's going to be really hard to make it uncontroversial with the broader public, right? So I think my hope for Germany is that, some of those control initiatives that the current government are doing, they, going to be popular with the public, right? And to the extent that the country is able to maximize those benefits from, and, actually attract people from all over the world for the skilled programs, right? We totally can broaden, right? So again, I fully agree with you that it's not just about the highest skilled immigration, right? It's about people of all kinds of skills, right? And I can tell you that there are actually a lot of really good programs that try to match asylum seekers or refugees from all over the world with the local communities where skills are needed, right? Again, you can do anything with your hands, right? And it's actually going to be useful and productive and good for a lot of communities around the world, right? I think the problem right now is if you claim an asylum somewhere and you come there and you get a lot of social support and people perceive it as unfair, right? I think that's kind of the status quo, which is not going to be ever popular with the public, unfortunately. Again, regardless of what some folks might normatively think about it, right? So my hope for Germany is to kind of redirect some of the flows that are currently existing from those kind of semi-planned, more humanitarian routes to more targeted, proactive and kind of work-related routes, right? Actually, there can be some overlap. It can be, again, like in my hypothetical example from earlier, it can be the exact same people from the same origin countries, right? But to the extent that we can accept them here or in other countries in a way that is clear to voters why it's needed in the country, I think that would be a much better situation.
And because we have very little time, maybe one of you could answer briefly. I don't know who feels more called to the question.
Yeah, I think the main lesson I get is that we can be a bit more optimistic. Yeah, I feel encouraged. Yeah, immigration can be popular, and the big puzzle is why do so few politicians see that and dare, yeah, take a more positive course and show the demonstrable benefits. Yeah, that's the point, and that's what we should argue for. It is beneficial at the moment, yeah, at least in Germany and many other countries, immigration is beneficial, and let's, yeah, argue that case, and let's not shy away from the extreme right and follow them, but yeah, rely on our ability to convince the population of the benefits, the various, not only economic benefits, but also, yeah, cultural, political, human rights. You say it's also beneficial, yeah, in many ways. Let's argue for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say this was one of the biggest takeaways for me as well, and unfortunately we're already at the end of our time. But I mean, I probably don't have to convince anyone that this is a very timely topic and a timely book, but I also want to say that I was very struck by kind of the realism and the level-headedness of the book, particularly in a climate, also a scholarly climate that isn't always calm, that can also be very agitated and partisan. And I really thought that, I really commend you for taking a stance in the book, but also kind of, you know, seeing and taking seriously both sides. Like you say that immigration is a difficult issue on which reasonable people actually disagree, and this I found this quote kind of emblematic of the tone and the nuance of the book. So I really think you deserve a lot of respect for writing this kind of book, particularly in the current climate. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that it was a real pleasure and honor to be able to discuss the book with you here today. I think we could have talked twice as long, but of course, you know, this needs to come to an end. We had 1.5 hours, and I really enjoyed my time. And I want to thank, of course, the panelists. I mean, Alex, first of all, but also Karen and Marc, and also the members of the audience. I'm sure there were more questions that we didn't get to. You know, maybe you can write to Alex or someone else on the panel.
Or here we can continue.
Or we can continue the discussion. That's great as well. And
things.
also thank you for everyone who helped organize this event behind the scenes, of course. And yeah, thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you.
Okay, we're out of the live stream, I